The word English comes from the word angle, and for years, English and Anglo-Saxon were synonyms. And that was understood for hundreds of years to be the origin of the English people. But then in the 20th century, left-wing academics started to question medieval narratives of the Anglo-Saxon migration. By 2019, this had reached woke levels, with people like Mary Ramber and Ulm actually campaigning for academics to stop using the word Anglo-Saxon because it's allegedly racist. This culminated in 2023 when the University of Cambridge told students that the Anglo-Saxons never existed as a distinct ethnicity, and he discouraged them from using the term Anglo-Saxon in an effort to fight what it called racism and nationalism. And then the following year, the University of Nottingham followed suit and said that they were removing the term Anglo-Saxon from their courses in an effort to decolonise the curriculum. But they ignored the fact that in medieval Britain, the word Anglo-Saxon was used to describe English people, and it isn't actually racist at all. And also, in 2022, a huge genetics paper was published which proved conclusively that the Germanic migrations of Anglo-Saxon peoples to the British Isles did occur, and that resulted in modern British people taking up to about half of their DNA from those 5th century Germanic migrants. But you know what? We don't actually have to rely on genetic evidence to prove the Anglo-Saxon migrations happened. It's been well known from archaeological evidence which German archaeologists all know about, and as a result they would never deny the Anglo-Saxon migrations because there is evidence in Germany of a mass exodus of people just leaving. By looking at the old homeland of the Angles and the Saxons on the continent, we can answer some of the questions that the medieval narratives of Welsh and English authors have presented to us. For example, in the 6th century, the Welsh monk Gildas wrote that the Saxons had been invited to Britain in the 5th century as mercenaries. But why would the Romanized Britons think specifically of the Saxons when they needed mercenaries? What is it about these Germanic tribes that made Romanized people associate them with military activities? Is it possible that these Angles and Saxons weren't really truly barbarians but were already Romanized to a certain degree? Well, I went to Germany and southern Denmark to find out for myself. And in part 1 of this 2-part series, I'm going to go to Niedersachsen, that's Lower Saxony in Germany, to show you some of the archaeological evidence. And in part 2, I'm going to Schleswig-Holstein and southern Denmark, the homeland of the Angles, and I'm going to look at some wonderful bog finds that give you great insight into the Roman Iron Age Germanic people. This is going to change the way you see the English and our relationship to the Germans. So to begin, let me introduce you to an historically significant, marshy, flat region of Germany you've probably never heard of, the Elbe-Weser Triangle.
I shot the sheriff, but I didn't shoot the deputy. I shot the sheriff, but I didn't shoot the deputy. All around my hometown, they are trying to track me down. They want to have me guilty for killing of the deputy.
This is the mouth of the Elbe River. Behind me, across the river, is the land of the Angles. Over this way is England. And over there is Lower Saxony. The Saxons and the Angles from either side of the Elbe would have used this river mouth on their migration towards Britain. Today this is a holiday resort, popular with many German tourists, mainly from other parts of the country, who enjoy typical beach activities like fairgrounds and paddling and what have you. The weather is grey and gloomy. It's windy. It's cold, even though it's the middle of summer. It's certainly not an unfamiliar place for an Englishman to be, although everyone is speaking German. Let's explore some of the ancient archaeology of the Anglo-Saxons before they came to Britain. Some of the marvellous creations of the Saxons and the Angles. This beautiful forest is in a region called Issendorf, and it's known as a necropolis because all around there are burials. There are Neolithic burial mounds, there are Bronze Age burial mounds, there are Saxon burials. Even in this little stretch of forest there's two barrows, and in between the two barrows there is a Saxon urn field. And that was like a style of pagan burial of our Saxon ancestors, where they put urns full of the burned remains of the dead into the ground, which is a very archaic form of burial that resembles things from Central Europe in the Bronze Age. But it's right next to much older barrows and many different forms of burial are practiced here. Many interesting artifacts have been found here, including bracteates, possibly depicting Woden. As soon as I entered this forest, the ravens started calling. There are so many ravens, and there's also the evidence of they're having their supper from a dead deer covered in maggots. This feels like a very holy place for the god Woden, and it's no wonder that a certain bracteate here has been connected by some archaeologists to the Anglo-Saxon charm of Lachnunga, in which Woden represents a sort of god of herbal magic. So the lady who wore this, it was a high status woman.
Yes, yes.
And this was cremated with her.
Yes.
Normally they wouldn't burn the such an artifact, I would have thought. Or
yes, they did. And unlucky, most of the artifacts were burned away.
And that was found here?
In Issendorf.
Even Issendorf, yes.
It's one of the biggest graveyards from the Saxons on the continent.
Was it part of the urn field?
Yes, yes. And we have there very, very strong connections to England. Mm-hmm. If we look at the brooches, at the art style of pottery, you find similar pottery in eastern England, in Essex, Kent or so.
It is so obvious that Saxon men and women shared the same fashion and culture as Anglo-Saxons. Compare this local woman's equal-armed brooch on the left with the two English examples on the right from Cambridgeshire and Suffolk. This is an Anglo-Saxon woman's burial from near Lechlade, Gloucestershire. Compare her grave goods on the left to those of the woman from Issendorf on the right. Note they both include an amber necklace and 2 gilt saucer brooches. Here are 2 more pairs from England. And another amber necklace from Lower Saxony. Amber is associated with the goddess Freya. These square-headed brooches were worn by women in England and Germany. This is an urn from Schleswig-Holstein, and this one is from Yorkshire. And this bumpy type of urn is from Lower Saxony, but there are more on the north side of the Elbe in the territory of the Angles. But in England, buckle urns are mainly found in the regions medieval sources say the Angles settled, rather than where the Saxons settled, so it's obvious that these medieval accounts of the settlement process were largely accurate. Although it's clear from some of these brooches that women certainly migrated to Britain, the initial invaders were male.
All of the graveyards here between Elbe and Weser, we have a lack of young men, because they were buried in England. Old people stayed here. It's like every migration. First of all, the young men are moving, and then they were maybe soldiers, and then they occupied England and were buried there.
And this one's from Issendorf?
Yes, Issendorf again, and also from a cremation.
5th century, contemporary with the Anglo-Saxon migration.
Yes, yes.
A woman's bow brooch, is this?
Yes,
bow
yes.
Brooch. And part of a cremation burial from the Urnfield.
You see a small part of the human bone, burnt bone.
Wow.
We find similar brooches in eastern England, northern Netherlands and northern France. And you can check out the routes of the migration, because they took the brooches with the groups, and then they were buried with a brooch there. And Issendorf is a very famous graveyard because it's the biggest graveyard from the continental Saxons. Around 6,000 graves were found there, and very rich graves too, because then we can say there's a social stratigraphication, because they were in contact with the Roman Empire, and they got money, gold, power, and took over the rules here in Saxony. A lot of people were soldiers or mercenaries in the Roman army. And then they get high rankings like officers and so on. And they saw the conditions on the British island, because the Roman army left the island. And then they took over the power because of the vacuum of Roman power. And then we have evidences for this strong connection, because there's a coin from Emperor Honorius.
A Celidi, is it?
Yes, yes. And you see the loop.
Solidus, yes, sir.
And they took it like
a necklace.
Yes.
A pendant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to show I'm part of the Roman power. And then, of course, in this time, the Roman emperor was godlike. And then they developed the bracteates from the Roman solidi. You see the face of the emperor, and then to Odin. It's the same kind of thinking.
These symbols of power Daneil is referring to originated in these gold Roman coins called Celidi. This one, from about 400 AD, depicts Emperor Honorius, who ruled from 393 to 423, and it was found near Hamburg. It would have been awarded to a Saxon mercenary in the Roman army, who took it home as a status symbol. Here's another Honorius Solidus, found nearby in Uderquart in the Stade district. This rather crude imitation was discovered in a field in Norfolk, England in 2023. Honorius ruled during the Anglo-Saxon migrations, and this shows that the Anglo-Saxons were already Romanized due to serving in the Roman military prior to arriving in Britain. They were all pagan at this time, but they copied the Christian imagery of the emperor seen on Roman Celidi coins, as a tradition that was already established back in Saxony. In Denmark, this custom of copying Celidi developed in the 4th century, whereby the images of Roman emperors were replaced by Germanic kings with Odinic motifs such as runes, snakes, and swastikas. These Germanic pagan medallions are now known as bracteates, and they were found all over the Germanic world. You shall see some Old Saxon examples of them later in this film.
Special coins were given to high-ranking officers or kings from the barbarians. They are very rare, very special, like Knight of the British Empire or so, something like that. And then we know that people from here were strong connected to the Roman Empire, to emperor and so on. Almost in every graveyard we find part of this Roman military belts. That means a big part of the young men were part of the Roman army.
What period are these found throughout?
5th century. It's the same time when they took over the rule in England.
Right.
Because they were well trained in Roman army. Then the Roman government became more and more weak. And then the Germanic tribes took over the power of this weak government.
In Britain.
In the 5th century, we can say a huge part of the Roman army was Germanic. The Romans didn't like to fight. They paid taxes, and with the money they paid barbarian mercenaries.
Do the dirty work.
Yeah.
And that didn't work out well for them in the
No,
end, I think.
because they didn't fight for the Romans for their own. Because when you have an army full of strange people, they fight for their own interests, not for yours. And a very special find. It's also new, because here you see the distribution of small Roman coins. East England is full of them. And then you see a few points here in Denmark, Sweden, Northern Germany and the Netherlands. And let me see. It's a very small coin called siliqua. It's made out of silver. Not so much left, but that's the face of a Roman emperor. But what's interesting is you see the cuttings here. They cut off the silver. Normally, I guess the coin was this size, but Britain was cut off from the mainland, and they had a lack of silver and gold and so on. And then to mine new coins, they had to cut off the silver from the other old coins. That's a special coin type we found only in Britain. And then mercenaries came back to their homelands and took the small coins back home.
So there wasn't just a migration there, but a back and forth sort of relationship between this region and Britain.
And you see the distribution is the same distribution of the first settlers, like Jutes, Angles and Saxons. And you see it's the same picture.
A very close correlation.
Yeah. You see the graveyards with strong connections to England, and you see the distribution of the Saxon and Angle genes.
So the archaeology and the genetics are completely in agreement.
And linguistic. If you see here the Saxon language, or English, Old English, and here Cornwall, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, with the Gaelic or Welsh languages. And we have a lot of place names are very strongly connected to from here to England, like Westburton, and so we have Toon, the same, or
There's Newark in England and Neuwerk here.
yes, the same. And then if you look at the old German language called Niederdeutsch or Plattdeutsch, my grandmother, they spoke it. They say not Wasser, they say Water, like you water, or cow for cow.
Wow.
And they're strongly connected. And this Plattdeutsch came from it's Old Saxon.
Really?
And then it was the lingua franca in Hanse times in the 14th century. They spoke it in Lithuania, in Finland, everywhere, like English now. But the connections are very, very strong in different on different layers. Linguistic, archaeological, biological. And that's very interesting for me.
All around the Issendorf Saxon burials are much earlier ones of the Daudiac necropolis. Each of these copses surrounds a Bronze Age barrow of the Bell-Beaker folk. But there are also even older monuments here as well. You may associate, Neolithic graves of the megalith culture, like with England, with the famous Stonehenge, and you'd think that the Anglo-Saxons coming to England would be encountering quite strange work, the work of giants, when they found them there. But they were familiar with these things already, because here in Saxony there are megalithic graves, like of the same type that you find in England. And this one is right next to the Saxon burial ground, and this one was also overlaid by evidence of the Bell-Beaker culture, the original Indo-European culture in this region, which is the ancestral culture of the insular Celts of Britain and Ireland. So not only do our Anglo-Saxon ancestors originate here, but our Celtic ancestors originate here. Oh, there's a little toad jumping away from me here. We have double roots, like all of our roots come from this part of the world, and there are layers of our history to be found in northern Germany. And this megalithic grave was evidently important enough to the early Indo-Europeans, the ancestors of northwestern European Celtic peoples, and also later northwestern European Germanic peoples, such that you can find this very English-seeming archaeological marvel. It's actually a long barrow going all the way through the woods here. It's not very well preserved, but pretty cool. More significant to the history of Germanic people than the Neolithic monuments are the barrows of the Bronze Age. So I am headed to some woodlands near Hamburg to admire their burial mounds. The rainy forest of oak and beech is exactly like those in England. The Nordic Bronze Age culture spread south from Denmark into Lower Saxony around 1700 BC. This culture is thought to have spoken the ancestor of Germanic languages, and it left large barrows in the landscape which continued to be important sites of worship for Germanic people right into medieval times. That's over 2,500 years of religious use. This restored barrow would have belonged to a man who boasted the famed bronze axes and other weapons of the era, as well as these special razors bearing motifs of solar significance. These bits and bobs were found in a rich barrow near Stade, and they all come from the Daneson folding chair. Here it is reconstructed as it would have looked back in 1400 BC. These chairs have been found all over Denmark, and they were like a throne, popular with Bronze Age kings. The continuity of this Bronze Age culture with that of the later Iron Age Saxons is most evident in a little village called Anderlingen. This is such a special place for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the wonderful Bronze Age burials here. Behind me is an enormous Bronze Age barrow. It dates to approximately 1700 BC originally, but there's a secondary burial in it for 1400 BC. And the stone pile here is something to do with the secondary burial. The initial burial, in a typical Scandinavian Nordic Bronze Age style, was an oak log coffin. Both of these are within the Nordic Bronze Age, which is the Bronze Age in Scandinavia. But much of Germany wasn't really part of that. The southern parts of Germany are more Central European. And Central Europe entered the Bronze Age much earlier than Scandinavia and had a different material culture associated with that. But this region represents the southernmost extent of proper Scandinavian influence in the Bronze Age. So this is really like a crossover zone for Europe between the Central European and Northern European Bronze Age cultures. And yet this kist grave here is nothing to do with Central Europe. This is a distinctly Nordic Scandinavian type of grave, which contains a picture stone with very obvious parallels with the kist burial found in a barrow in southern Sweden at Kivik, about which I've done a video previously, because the interior of those slabs for that kist burial have pictures depicting a funeral scene, just like this one does. Now this kist is actually a reconstruction based on what was discovered by a farmer, and the pictures of probably worshipful members of the funeral congregation for the great man who was buried here, they're exactly like in Kivik. But this was found in association with the burial of the barrow behind. So what we're seeing is a clear evidence of Germanic people coming into the continent around the early Nordic Bronze Age, 1400 BC or something, because the Germanic languages, which are now so associated with Germany, don't come from Germany originally, they come from Scandinavia. And this area is clear evidence of the spread of the Germanic culture out of Scandinavia into the continent. The barrow was reused for a second burial, as I say, around 1400 BC, but that wasn't the last time this place was used. Because the second reason that this is such a special place is because there was continued ritual activity here from the Bronze Age all the way through into the Roman Iron Age and even the Migration era. And that's the time when the ancestors of the English, the Anglo-Saxons, migrated from this region of Germany into Britain, resulting in the English people. So we can really see that this one archaeological site clearly represents not only the movement of Germanic people from Scandinavia into Germany, but also the movement of Germanic people from Germany into Britain. So all in one place, marvelously illustrating the international spread of our people. This has been beautifully reconstructed The barrow had to be reconstructed, and I think it's done tastefully, but the barrow isn't original. The stone circle that surrounds the cist is actually modern, and some of the stones have been taken from southern Sweden, perhaps as a nod to the origin of the cultural tradition of stone kists in the Bronze Age in Scandinavia. There are also many other Germanic finds from this area, because the third burial, as I say, a woman from the Germanic migration era was buried in that Bronze Age barrow, on the top part of it, on top of, she's crammed in. So they probably remembered that this is such an important place for Germanic people and wanted to give this lady the honor of being buried within it. And there are artifacts from here, from this area, and also from a neighboring barrow, which contained a Saxon chieftain who had served in the Roman military. He came back here and he would have been wealthier than other people, and that afforded him a special barrow burial containing lovely grave goods. And some of the wonderful migration and Iron Age era finds from this region include a beautiful gilt mount of a kind of head of the god Woden, like the one I got on my t-shirt. This one's from an English find, and it depicts the head of the main Saxon god Woden, comprised of two ravens, whereas the one that was found here, which I'll show on screen now, has the head contained within a single raven, gilt, and that would have been worn on the individual and clearly demonstrated their affiliation to the god Woden, who was so important to the military aristocracy, such as that chieftain. So here we have a place that was sacred to the god Woden, sacred to the Saxon people. It should be sacred to the English people today, as we remember our ancestors worshipped here. For a period of perhaps 2,000 years, this was a sacred place. So what a wonderful place to include in this documentary. I think it's appropriate now that I make an offering to the great men of the barrow and ask them to bless this film. It isn't stressed enough how important Roman influence was on the Saxons, so let's look at some more evidence. As we move into the so-called Roman Iron Age, that is the first 400 years of the Common Era, there is a clear effort to emulate Roman-style artifacts, as on this urn from Västervana near Cuxhaven. These metal buckets from the same region are actually of Roman origin, but many of them were imported to Germany in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, where they were deposited in hoards along with cauldrons and other objects. They are named Hemmoor type buckets, after a small Saxon town near Cuxhaven, where some were found. They were used as urns, and later on the Angles and Saxons developed other kinds of elaborate wooden buckets, which were included in burials. This is a reconstruction of a 4th century barrow tomb of a chief from Neudorf-Boinstein. Note the buckets to his left. These metal and wood funeral buckets may have contained ritual liquids for washing or drinking, and in some cases cremated ashes, as in the earlier Roman types. The same kind were used by Anglo-Saxons in England over 300 years later. These two are from Haslingfield in Cambridgeshire. Many other items of Roman manufacture were imported, including this beautiful gem. This figurine of the god Mercury, who was associated with the Germanic god Wotanaz, there's Woden, and this one was found in Neuenwalde. Note the Roman coins as well. During this period, we also see the emergence of a distinctly Germanic art style with Scythian influences. This gold disc from Tannendorf dates to around 300 AD and features an early example of the backward-facing beast motif, which endures for a further 800 years into the Viking Age. This urn, with solar stamps and glass beaker from the 5th century, both have clear parallels in Anglo-Saxon England. This is an urn from England for comparison. Beginning in the 5th century, we start to see evidence of horse sacrifices and burials across England. These continued for over 200 years until the Christians banned the English religion. The prehistoric Indo-European ritual of horse burial was revived in post-Roman Europe by the Saxons, Thuringians, and Lombards in the 5th century. The Old Saxons here continued it for longer than the English. This triple horse sacrifice is from around 800 AD. Maybe these horses were offerings for the gods, or maybe they helped the dead to travel to the next world and maintain their high status there too. This 17th century castle is a museum containing some incredible Saxon archaeology. At Falvard, near Landwürsten by the coast, are 2 Saxon graveyards containing 260 burials, including 2 5th century boat burials, precedents of the famous 7th century Sutton burial of England. The most impressive of these was a 4.5 metre long oak boat, which had been modified for use as a tomb, with a wooden roof added. It dates to the 5th century, when the local people were migrating to Britain. The burial was for an important man who died aged about 50, but from his exquisite Roman military belt, we can tell he served in the Roman army during his youth.
And we find a lot of belt parts from Roman military belts. They were used as a status symbol.
They may have been worn in a different context, in a Germanic situation.
When they came back and survived the Roman army, they used it as a status. And they were buried with a belt.
Yes. His grave and others at Falvard also preserved beautiful examples of Saxon carpentry and wood turning. He was buried with this special kind of chair made from alder, which is called a klotzstoel. They are associated exclusively with high-status male graves. The swastika patterns are associated with the cult of the god Woden. It was accompanied by a matching swastika footstool, which is a carving of a dog hunting a deer or elk on the underside. The edge of the stool is inscribed with runes. The first word, scamella, is mangled Latin for bench, and the second part says alguscarthi, which means elk harm, possibly in reference to the picture underneath, which may depict the man's hunting dog. Like the Roman belt, the chair and footstool were potent symbols of power and status, showing not only runic literacy, but knowledge of Latin as well. Sophisticated skills of turning and joinery are demonstrated in this little table, on which food was served, rather like a Japanese chabudai. This extraordinary bird-shaped vessel is unique. We know waterfowl were associated with the dead and the otherworld in Germanic religion, so this could be a cult object made for the funeral. We don't know what it contained. These wooden-soled sandals are a precursor to modern clogs and would be ideal for traversing the marshy wet grounds of Lower Saxony. They could also be the same as the hell shoes referred to in the Norse religion, specifically in Gisla Saga, where special shoes are put on a corpse to help the dead man wade through the rivers of hell and reach Valhall. These are reconstructions of some of those finds to show you how they might originally have looked. The other boat grave was for a less elaborate dugout canoe, which contained an adult woman. She was buried with a stool and various wooden vessels, as well as beads and a spindle whorl, which would have had magical associations. In the 2nd century, the Greek geographer Ptolemy described the largely unexplored regions east of the Rhine. He was the first person ever to mention the Saxons, describing them in Book 2 of Geography as living east of the Cimbrian Peninsula, meaning the Jutland Peninsula, and north of the River Elbe, the region which was later the territory of the Angles. He must not have realised that the Saxons also lived south of the Elbe, in the region of Cuxhaven. But Ptolemy did mention a settlement there called Fabiranum, which is most likely the Saxon fortress of Heidenschanze. This is the most important archaeological site in the territory of the Old Saxons.
I guess 20 or 30 years ago it was very open, but now it's a protection area for nature, and then we have a problem in Germany with ecologists. We see the fortification of the Heidenschanze, here the first rampart, around 2 meters high, and then the second one, the outer part, and a ditch between them. And here we have the inner circle, another rampart with ditch. You can see here the ditch of the inner circle, and they included a burial mound, a huge Bronze Age burial mound. And you can see here, we are here on the top of the burial mound. The second one is included. They used it as a symbol of the past, because the landscape, the former landscape, was filled up with burial mounds, megalithic tombs, and they used it as a sacrifice, a holy landscape. I guess it was very impressive when you imagine it was full of old burial mounds and graves.
Do you believe that the Saxons may have chosen this site for a fort?
Yes.
Because of the presence of Bronze Age burial ground?
Yeah. Because of their long history. I guess it's a symbol for strong ancestors, and that they own the landscape for ages.
It's interesting that the Anglo-Saxons in England, they saw the Bronze Age barrows there the same way.
Yes.
And they continued to make burial grounds where they saw Bronze Age barrows.
Yeah.
They saw Bronze Age barrows as somehow related to their religion.
And you see remnants of a rampart now covered by bog. And they found wooden palisades, and they dated in the 1st century AD. When they built this fortification, the Roman tried to take over the rule over Germania. They planned the border on the river Elbe. And you know, in 9 AD, Arminius beat the Romans out of Germania. And maybe that was a stronghold to defend the coastline against Roman raids or invasions too. That they tried to protect this region against Romans, because in Germanic it was very uncommon build fortifications like this. We find them in Denmark, Sweden, but in Germany they are very uncommon. Maybe it's an influence of Scandinavia to defend this region against Romans. But because when they start to build this fortification, Caesar was on the River Rhine. And the Romans changed here everything. The social structure. In the pre-Roman Iron Age, my professor at the university told us it's a scrap culture. Only iron and pottery, nothing else, very boring. But when the Romans reach the river Rhine, we find bronze vessels, weapons, golden objects, silver, and the stratification of the society starts. We find people like kings. The villages emerge. In pre-Roman Iron Age, you have only farmsteads, no villages, and it changed everything. Romans thought in structures. They had a capital, and when they took over a capital, they took over the country. But the Germans didn't have capitals like the Gallic people in France. If you took over an oppidum, you took over the whole country of the Gallic tribes. But in Germany, they destroyed the villages. They catched women and men. But the people moved into the wood. When the Romans left, they came back. That's for Romans, for Roman thinking, strategy. It was very problematic to took over a whole landscape, and the people escape everywhere. But I guess we go to the Heidenstadt, and it was used until the 6th century. But the whole landscape was used through the early medieval, and if you see, a lot of gold bracteates were found here around Heidenstadt.
Before Daneil shows us the migration era fort of Heidenstadt, I just want to show some of the local bracteates he mentioned that have been found near the forts at Sutton. These are 7 such examples from the surrounding area. This head represents a local Wodenic king wearing an elaborate headdress. The runes refer to the magical act of writing itself, and this is connected to the speech of the man issuing forth from his mouth, which you can actually see. Some have connected this to the divine breath of Woden, with which he gave life to the first man and woman. This highly stylized design depicts a mounted king with a raven projecting forwards from his head or headdress, marking him as one who possesses the wisdom of Woden. It was found just to the north of Heidenschanze. A new bracteate was recently found here too.
Found last year by a metal detectorist, and you see the face of Odin.
Yes.
His eye.
Yes.
Hair.
Yeah. That's wonderful.
Then the snake or a worm. It's since 20 years the first find in Lower Saxony. It was a lucky day for him for the find.
Absolutely beautiful artifact.
I particularly love this local bracteate from Sutton, which depicts a man performing some kind of ritual dance with 2 snakes. A similar motif is depicted on foils from Anglo-Saxon England. These examples come from Berkshire and Lincolnshire. Slightly to the north of Heidenschanze is its successor fort, Heidenstadt, or Heathenstead, which was in use during the Anglo-Saxon migrations.
45. Yes, it is from the 4th and 5th century. It's younger than the Heidenschanze, and it's an assembling site 2 and fortification 2. And scholars thought that the Saxons, before they go to England, they meet each other here, move to the boats on the northern sea, and then move to England. Maybe it was a very important site for Saxons.
So inside would have been a settlement of some sort?
We didn't find so much remnants of a settlement. I think they used it temporarily for fortification when the enemy came, and for meetings annually or so on. And then you can imagine we are on a small hill for northern Germany. If you cut off all the wood, you had a nice view over the peatlands and over the landscape, and you can see the enemy. most of the forests were cut off for cooking, burning. iron.
Palisades for this fortification. This was palisaded as well?
Yes,
It would have been quite a significantly
Yeah.
fortified area. Why is this specifically thought to be a place which might have been central to the Anglo-Saxon migration?
Because of the situation near the coastline, and then it's unique. We don't have things like this from the 4th or 5th century in northern Germany.
There aren't any other places that could be used for it.
No, maybe from River Elbe, but it's a central site in a very important region. You know, this Bracteate finds, Falwart, Feddersenwierde. It's one of the most important landscape of the Old Saxons in North Germany.
So this would have been initially like a pirate base or something, or
Maybe. The North Sea is not far away.
yeah. And there is a small body of water, a small river leading out to the sea, which might facilitate some movement to the ocean.
Not far away from here, you have these famous dwelling mounds like Feddersenwierde and Falwart, where the famous finds in Bederkesa came from. You know, the chair with...
Beautiful chair, the stool and the block chair.
Yeah,
And there was a boat found at Falwart as well, right?
Yes. And that's not far away from here. They were connected to each other.
It's a sort of chieftain that
Yeah.
we might have dwelled in this very place, some military leader.
And in one grave in Falwart, they found a former officer of the Roman military. And you see the landscape around. Behind there's another peatland where they found golden objects. The offering sites are located around the fortifications here. There may be holy landscapes for the people then.
The wetlands, the trees.
But around Sievern, we have the highest concentration of gold bracteates in Germany.
Wow.
Everywhere they were made offerings to Odin or the gods, and that makes this landscape around Sievern so important. You can see there, because of the gold bracteates, the strong connections between Scandinavia and the area between Elbe and Weser. And then we have findings from western part of Europe, from Merovingian times and so on. It was a very important region because of the biggest rivers in Germany, Weser and Elbe. And then you can go from here to Scandinavia, to England, to France by boat. And in the 5th and 6th century, it was a very, very important landscape here.
In the 5th century, do you think there was enough like intertribal cohesion that they were able to organize this migration? What do you think the communication might have been like between people here and on north of the Elbe?
You must assume strong leaders with like a Gefolgschaft, and then they had the power to take over England, because there were people and left and a bit Roman power was left, but they have very strong units, I guess, and they had the opportunities to take over huge parts of Europe, like northern Netherlands, northern France, and then England.
So there was an expansion into the Netherlands as well.
Yes. Also in the 5th century, we find a lot of pottery brooches connected to Saxons from here in the Netherlands. A lot of settlements in the North Netherlands coast were abandoned in the 4th century, and then a century later, Saxon took over this region from here.
And this may explain the relationship between the Anglo-Saxon runes and the Frisian runes.
Yes.
They're quite similar.
Yeah. Yes.
Large parts of the area around Heidenschanze were abandoned from the 5th century and remained mostly empty until the 7th century, when it was repopulated. Why did they all leave? The withdrawal of the Roman legions from the Limes in 406 began a process of de-Romanization, with the last units disappearing from the region in the mid-5th century. This withdrawal disrupted the contacts that Germanic lords in Scandinavia and Denmark had with the Roman military and Roman slave traders, essentially cutting them off from their main economic partner, the Roman Empire. The Angles and Saxons had been well positioned as an axis through which all kinds of trade passed, but when this trade stopped, all kinds of economic and social disruption would have occurred. At the same time, the former colony of Britannia was left undefended and ripe for the picking. Additional push factors such as flooding or crop failure could have contributed to a mass migration of the sort Germanic people had already been known for centuries. In the end, Romanization unlocks the mystery of the migration. It explains how the Saxons built the military prowess necessary to join forces with other tribes for a massive invasion of Britain. And it reveals why Romano-British leaders turned to these very warriors as mercenaries once Rome had crumbled. In the 1st century, Strabo wrote specifically of the Germanic peoples between Frisia and Jutland, saying, "Migrations easily occur from these regions due to the shared characteristics of the people. When these migrations occur, people move in massive crowds formed from numerous households, and they bring with them an army." Like the Old Saxons, I'm now following the waterways to the great river Elbe, to take the ferry across into what used to be the land of the Angles, now encompassing all of the northernmost German state of Schleswig-Holstein, as well as the southern part of the Jutland Peninsula in Denmark. In the next episode, you will see some of the remarkably well-preserved bog finds from this region, including bog bodies, clothes, weapons, golden marvels, and even entire boats. And you will learn why these places were sacred to our ancestors. Don't miss it.